No joke. Biscuit Oliva has got to be one of Baki's toughest opponents. Scratch that. He has to be Baki's toughest opponent. I'm Dr. Chris and I am not your everyday ortho. This fight was so full of brutal hand-to-hand excitement that I decided to break it into a 3-part series, of which this is the 3rd part. I'll leave the links to the previous 2 videos so you can queue them up for later. But since you're here, let me catch you up to speed. So far, a normal human would be a chunky tissue smoothie in a bag of skin. No human spine can withstand this level of blunt force trauma without fracture. And Biscuit doesn't stop there. That's the thing about challenging the strongest man in the world. He can throw you around like a wet towel, crumble reinforced concrete, and crush industrial steel like a tin can. And if you find yourself in his way, you may find yourself falling onto your back. Do you see now why it took us so long to cover this fight? Every single strike would cause severe damage to the average human being. And if Baki anatomy was more realistic, I would expect major spinal trauma and fractures, internal organ damage, a concussion, multiple fractures and dislocations in the extremities, and possibly even, I don't know, death. But it's not. And all of this punishment only serves to awaken Baki's true power. Oliva knows it too, and welcomes the demon back with a smile. And finally, Baki is ready to inflict some damage of his own. He demonstrates immaculate precision, striking what I believe to be the carotid sinus, a reflex area in the carotid artery which helps regulate the flow of blood and oxygen to the head. A sudden jolt to this structure could alter blood and oxygen flow enough to knock somebody. Unsurprisingly, Oliva reacts to Baki's impressive attack like a proud father rather than a life or death opponent. The move he's referring to, user illusion, is a technique that takes advantage of the delay between thought and action. You see, it takes 500 milliseconds for the sensory information from the outside world to travel through our nerves into our brain, where it is incorporated into our conscious experience. Some senses are processed at slightly different speeds, and our brain must account for these differences as it attempts to maintain a seamless experience of the outside world. Psychologists at the University of Texas set up a study that would demonstrate that because of this, we can manipulate conditions so that it seems like cause and effect are reversed. If a voluntary action, like say pressing a button,
you remember the little red button? Yeah, push the little red button,
is followed by a delayed effect, such as a flash,
ladies and gentlemen, if you will, look right here.
The brain will create the sensation that the two are closer together in time than they really are. Experimenters would set off a flash of light after a preset delay of a small fraction of a second. They then ask test subjects to press the button repeatedly.
Look, I'm pressing it! You see me pressing it!
After a while, the researchers removed the delay so that the flash occurred instantaneously. When they next pushed the button, the subjects had the weird experience that the flash was happening before the action had triggered it. Baki initiates movement and lands a hit in under 500 milliseconds. He has learned to move so fast that he erases the delay between thought and action, such that Biscuit literally has no chance to register what has happened. The sensory information has not yet been processed into experience. And since he can't move nearly as quickly, it's only natural that he responds with a special move of his own. Biscuit literally folds his body into an impervious ball of muscle in what appears at first to be an extreme defensive maneuver. First of all, I love it. It's quirky, it's impressive, it's Baki, but it is a far cry from reality. When a human being gets down into a cross-legged position like this, they look more like this. Hi. Biscuit's upper body, back, specifically his latissimus muscles, have grown to an otherworldly size. And there is no doubt that he spent countless hours refining this technique. Needless to say, it's not possible to achieve this type of size without some performance-enhancing drug assistance. And in this position, to maintain anything like a spherical shape, every single muscle on the front side of Biscuit's body would need to be activated to a very high degree. The abdominals and hip flexors. I think the least believable part of this is that Oliva's head is bowed and stacked directly behind his fists. And while the forearms guard him from blunt force head trauma, a blow like Baki's flying kick would match the pressure of the kick against the strength of Biscuit's neck muscles. If the kick exerts more force than the neck muscles can withstand, then Biscuit's head would be bowed into excessive flexion while under a fair amount of sudden axial loading due to Baki's foot. These forces could result in injury to the cervical spine. I'd be particularly worried about cervical wedge and burst fractures, which are the result of flexion and vertical compression respectively. Biscuit might also suffer an atlanto-occipital dislocation, another type of flexion injury involving the C1 and C2 vertebrae. But somehow, Baki is repelled? I'm about as incredulous as our narrator. A punch with enough power to generate this type of steam would also put the cervical spine at risk for all the reasons that we just talked about. But I guess Biscuit's neck is just that powerful because, well, Baki logic. Now, if his cervical spine isn't going to suffer an injury under these circumstances, it seems unlikely that any other body part would either. If these wrists were the wrists of a normal human being, I might be worried. Look at the way they are stacked against the top of Biscuit's skull so that when Baki delivers his punch, they are in perfect position to be crushed between the two hard surfaces. While distal radius fractures are a common result of the fall onto outstretched hand mechanism, they can also occur due to excessive crushing forces. And let's be honest, these are more like cinder blocks than hands.
The brick here, I got it at my local brickyard. You don't want just any Joe Schmo brick.
Can anyone say comminuted? You know, like when the bone is crushed into several little pieces and good-willing surgeons like myself unleash an arsenal of surgical hardware to reconstruct the crushed bone the best that we can. Also curious is the fact that neither Biscuit nor Baki move at all following this collision, even though Baki throws his full weight into the punch. We hear the sound of metal striking metal, but there isn't any visual indicator of the impact. No bounce, no shockwave, no nothing. And then Biscuit swallows Baki whole. Is this some advanced form of grappling of which I am not aware? The most striking part about this move is that Biscuit's ball doesn't grow any larger once he has consumed Baki. There is a whole, another human being crushed inside his grasp, squeezed into the crevices between his gigantic muscles. God only knows what configuration Baki's body has been forced into in order to squeeze into such a tiny space. I can imagine joint dislocations at the less severe end of the spectrum and fractures and crushed bones at the other. If we freeze frame at the moment that Biscuit ejects his opponent, we get a hint at how his body may have been compressed, and it's very similar to this. The only logical conclusion is that Baki is trained as a high-level contortionist. But to be honest, I don't think any amount of experience in the contortion sphere could save a person from the Biscuit ball.
I will be teaching you how to remove your spine.
There is literally no space. He literally doesn't change sizes. Baki's body would pretty much have to be liquefied to fit inside Biscuit in this way. And that doesn't bode well for the structural integrity of any human tissue or structure. No interns, you cannot survive in a trash compactor. And after all the punishment he has taken thus far, Baki is cool, calm, and cocky even. You know what, Baki? You're a little too smug. Back to the ball with you. The narrator said the ball was shrinking, even more so than before. But if there's nowhere to go, then there's nowhere to go. Unless Biscuit collapses his body with such force that his interior becomes a black hole, like my God, we've finally cracked the code. If Baki was positioned inside Biscuit like the contortionist I mentioned before, and Biscuit was crushing him further into said position, even though it doesn't look like Biscuit's size has changed to accommodate the human being inside of him.
Hey, yo!
Baki's cervical spine would have its turn in the spotlight. Hypothetically, if a person is flexible enough through the lumbar spine to be folded in half at the waist, the torso roughly matches the length of the femur, offering some form of support to the thoracic spine, but the head sticks out beyond the knees, exposing the cervical spine to damage if the head gets pushed too far forward. While the neck is fairly flexible and strong, biscuit ball pressure could easily overload the vertebrae there until... Oh, and let's not gloss over the fact that Biscuit put dents in the concrete floor with what appears to be the ball of his bare foot. I think a fracture to the first or second proximal phalanges or the distal metatarsal is more likely than a crack in the concrete floor. But hey, I don't see Biscuit waiting around for an orthopedic surgeon to check him out. And then Baki strikes back. Did somebody say lobotomy? Okay, maybe not, but pause. This type of attack would stop even the strongest fighter dead in their tracks. Aside from the sheer thickness of Baki's fingers tearing the tissue inside the nasal cavity, Baki's pointer and middle fingers are probably over 2.5 inches long at the very least, and while the nasal cavities are long enough to accommodate such lengthy visitors, the angle of attack denotes something more than a thorough swabbing. Baki seems to be attacking in a vertical motion, sending his fingers straight up into Biscuit's skull rather than curling them back into his nasal cavity. I can envision a perforated cribriform plate, the part of the ethmoid bone that forms the roof of the nasal cavity. Now, the ethmoid bone is a cube-shaped structure located in the center of the skull between the eyes. It helps form the walls of the eye socket or orbital cavity, as well as the roof, sides, and interior of the nasal cavity. This structure is very light, very complex, and sponge-like in texture. It really doesn't adapt well to blunt force trauma. Like, not at all. A fracture of the cribriform plate, which is the thinnest portion of the base of the skull, is indicative of severe head or facial trauma, as its location is sufficiently recessed inside the face and skull such that it cannot be reached by a love tap. Fractures of the cribriform plate can be associated with septal hematoma, olfactory dysfunction, cerebral spinal fluid leak, or infection, which can progress to meningitis. Judging by the size of the puddle of blood on the floor, it's likely that Baki has broken some of the blood vessels in Biscuit's nose. This type of nosebleed can be profuse, appearing to ooze blood. I don't think Biscuit likes being attacked in an area where his muscles can't defend him. Baki shakes off being thrown 20 feet into a concrete wall, and our combatants approach for a final exchange. No blocking, just haymakers. This exchange twists their necks in a sudden and very disconcerting way, reminiscent of the way characters perform stealth kills in video games and movies. The Hollywood neck snap is hyperbole and would require a crazy amount of power to execute successfully, as our neck and supporting anatomy is fairly robust. But given enough power, a sudden neck snap can sever the spinal cord, subsequently preventing the brain from communicating with the rest of the body. And what happens to a person when the lungs can't take in air and the heart begins to stop beating? You will die. But obviously their spinal cords are still intact because they've decided to swing harder this second time. Now, we have 14 facial bones, and when I see a punch like this, I fear for all of them, especially the nasal bones and the zygomaxillary complex, which form the central shape of the midface. You know, the part of the face that is caving in against their fists. I don't think either Baki or Biscuit are concerned that Lefort fractures of the midface become more difficult to repair as the fracture becomes more severe, and more comminution is present in this area. They can both look forward to an array of surgical hardware in and around their face. Yet our fighters show no sign of letting up. It looks like Baki finally has Biscuit on the ropes as the strongest man in the USA throws a desperate blow, collapsing Baki's body into a bridge-like position. But Biscuit, by now you should know that Baki's power is a direct response to the damage that he has taken. It's like he stores kinetic energy upon getting hit and releases it when he retaliates. Kind of like a capacitor. And a headbutt. Baki buries his forehead into Biscuit's midface with enough energy to drive his whole body through the concrete wall. Whew. That last one was just to make sure. If the next time I see Baki he's grown back his front teeth.
Nothing makes f***ing sense. Life makes no sense.
I hope the Arizona State Prison has a good facial surgeon because Biscuit is going to need to have some work done. If you liked the video, be sure to subscribe. And if you didn't, be sure to let me know why in the comment section down below. As always, that's been a word from Dr. Chris, not your everyday ortho, where we see one, do one, and teach one.